Welcome to Lecture for Research Methods. Be talking about sections of Chapter 1 and Chapter 6 of the APA manual, and then pulling from some other resources as well to talk about issues related to ethics in research. So starting off, we'll talk about why we have ethical standards, and really three primary reasons. The first, to protect the rights and welfare of participants. Right? And when we talk about participants, this applies obviously to people who are what we typically or might refer to as research subjects, but it also addresses people who participate in the conduct of research, students, trainees, lab assistants, what have you, because we have an obligation to those who agreed to be subjects and those who agreed to help us. Unfortunately, history is marked by instances where participants' rights weren't protected. One of the more glaring examples in America is some of you may know about already, the Tuskegee syphilis study. Right, this is where Department of Health in Tuskegee was conducting research on syphilis, and they diagnosed syphilis in a population of predominantly black men. Didn't tell them they had syphilis, told them they had something else. Sometimes they'd say, oh, it's bad blood, or they give some other vague diagnosis because they wanted to know what the natural progression of the disease was. So they didn't tell them, and they didn't treat them. Highly unethical behavior. And at the time, again, they thought, oh, well, we need to know the course of this disease, and if we hadn't diagnosed them at all, they wouldn't have got treatment anyway, so we're really not doing anything wrong. But clearly, looking back now, we can say, yes, you were doing something wrong. So to say that we can just trust people's conscience to guide them, and scientists won't hurt people or abuse their power. Yeah, apparently they will if left to themselves, and especially if they get distracted from human needs and rights by their focus on whatever their scientific question is, which some scientists may tend to do. So we've got to have things in place, standards in place to protect the participants. But there are also standards for the sake of science to ensure the accuracy of scientific knowledge. Right? Certain unethical practices, like the falsification of data, could contaminate our knowledge pool and put science off course. Right? Somebody says they found something and it wasn't true. Everybody else looks to replicate that, and will waste all this time and resources chasing down the wrong avenue. Right? So you have a responsibility to science itself to be accurate, but then there's also a responsibility to society, because in most cases society will be impacted by science, by what we find. And if what we find is based on falsified or inaccurate data, we're going to make poor recommendations. Right? If we tell everyone that, oh, there's no negative effects of drug use, it's fine, go ahead, that obviously could be a very bad thing. So you wouldn't want to make up studies saying that drugs were good for you. Recent example of somebody using questionable research practices, Andrew Wakefield, one of the authors who published that article back in 1998, linking autism to vaccines. Eventually a retraction was published, and all the other authors, like 11 authors I think on that paper, said, oh no, our conclusions weren't consistent with the data we had, except for this Wakefield guy who continued to say, oh no, this is right. And this guy was guilty of multiple ethical violations and eventually had his license to practice medicine in the United Kingdom taken away. Now I think he's in Austin, unfortunately. He did things like he didn't disclose that he was a paid legal advisor in ongoing lawsuits related to vaccinations. Right, so he had kind of this potential source of conflict of interest. Other just kind of creepy things. Well, he handpicked kids to be in his study without a documented justification for inclusion criteria. He paid kids at his son's birthday party $8 a piece to donate blood, to get blood samples. So kind of a creepy guy, and then did some things in terms of violating the standards of how science should be conducted and not being forthright about it in such a way that ended up putting forth knowledge that wasn't accurate and wasn't valid by current scientific standards. So to protect rights and welfare of participants, to ensure the accuracy of scientific knowledge, and then the third thing would be to protect intellectual property rights. Right? And these standards are in place to protect researchers from getting ripped off, right? Because all they don't have any money or cars or nice clothes. They have ideas, and they want credit for their ideas. And there's generally an understanding that people should get credit for their work. And if we didn't have standards to protect this, then some of the motivation for doing research would likely be taken away, right? Because again, they're not getting famous and rich for this, but they're getting credit in the academic glory for these discoveries. And if people were allowed to just take their ideas from them and say that they were their ideas, it would take away a lot of the motivation to do the research that is important for so many of us. So it's important to protect those rights, and it's also important to remember that if you violate those rights, even unintentionally, it can have some negative consequences. And one of the most striking examples is Martin Luther King Jr., example of someone who was guilty of plagiarism, and by most accounts engaged in it unintentionally. Right? While doing some of his academic work, doctoral work and whatnot, it appears he had more of a mindset of a theologian than an academic, right? Which theologians have kind of different rules and different expectations about repeating and using the words of others. They have different traditions about how to cite. And so he didn't cite appropriately. And unfortunately, some people have used this to try and discredit him and his other very important work. Right? So it's important to keep in mind that plagiarism can be costly, and it can really damage your reputation and then cost you other things as well, even if you don't intend to do it, even if it is unintentional. Okay, so 3 primary reasons we have ethical standards. Where do these standards come from? Well, the history in the U.S., probably the first standardized publication for guidelines, specifically for working with human subjects, would be the Belmont Report, right? And it was published by the U.S. Department of Health, Education and Welfare, and it was really done in response to the public outcry over the Tuskegee experiments. And people found out what had happened, said, "Oh, clearly we need some oversight here. We need some rules for you nerds." And so the Belmont Report came out, and a lot of the fundamental values put forth in the Belmont Report you can still see today in other ethical codes and laws which we're currently operating under. Fast forward a couple of decades, we get the what's typically referred to as the Common Rule. Longer name would be the Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects. This is just, like I said, an update to the Belmont Report. It's federal policy, but not law. Right. So what that means is, if you're doing any research that uses federal funds, you have to abide by these guidelines. Otherwise, they don't pay you. Right. If you're not using federal funds, it doesn't mean that they don't apply at all. In some ways, you're not governed by them. But a judge may use these federal guidelines to help discern whether or not you're guilty in a civil court if a research participant sues you. So it's a good idea to follow the rules anyway, even if you're not receiving federal funds, because they're accepted as the professional standard of acceptable conduct, okay, even if they're not laws per se. And then professional organizations, which you will undoubtedly belong to, have drafted their own set of ethical guidelines, which many of them reflect the Common Rule, at least the sections on research. And APA, ACA, they all have sections on research ethics. APA's is probably the most comprehensive ethics code when it comes to research, and these again aren't laws but guidelines, and violating them could lead to expulsion from the organization, kicked out, and also courts will consult these guidelines when reviewing lawsuits, and also the licensing board will look at these things when looking at ethics complaints against you by any research participant or client. So again, they kind of set the professional standards. So it's important to be aware of what the ethics code says for your professional organization. Okay. But across organizations, there are a couple of guiding principles that they typically have in common, and we'll talk about a few of those. Okay. The first is respect for persons and their autonomy. And this is a recognition that people are not property. They have a right to self-determination. And this is really aimed at getting researchers to shift away from seeing seeing human subjects as lab rats, right? Because so much early research was done with animals, and then whenever researchers began psychology, this new science started doing behavioral stuff instead of rats and pigeons with people. They had this mindset of, well, it's a research participant. It is not a person, right? And so we had to have some clear guidelines in there that they are people, and people have rights. And a lot of people argue that animals should have more rights, and that is a fair debate to have. But it is a debate. What's not debatable is that human beings have certain unalienable rights, at least in the States. Another guiding principle would be beneficence and non-maleficence, right? You aim to do good, and you aim not to do harm. And this is for both participants, so you don't hurt participants, and also to society at large. So your scientific endeavor should try to answer questions that will in some way benefit society and not hurt society. We shouldn't do research on how can you most efficiently kill people. And I'm sure some people do that research, but it would violate the ethics codes of most professional organizations of psychologists and other therapists. Justice, which is about using obviously just or fair practices, not exploiting disadvantaged individuals as participants. If there's a study where you have participants will be subjected to electric shock or some other aversive stimulus, and you give a $5 incentive, that's maybe okay. If you give a $100 incentive or a $1,000 incentive, now am I being just? Because once I raise the incentive, it makes it harder for people with lower incomes to say no. And so they may take on more of the burden of participating in studies that aren't pleasant to be in because they need the money more, and it's really hard to say no when you got to pay your bills. Right? The other aspect of justice has to do with if you're using a community to conduct research, and then you go and you learn something about an intervention, and you just go and you take that intervention and you employ it to some other community, that's not just, right? If you use a community or some population for your research, they should get some of the benefits of that research as well in a just world. Right? Again, and these are kind of ideals, guiding principles. Trust. We try not to lie to participants, at least not directly. And some studies may involve deception, but you have to debrief when you do that. And certain things you can't lie about. You can't say that there's no harm when there really is. Right? And then the last one would be fidelity and scientific integrity. This is about being honest in the pursuit of knowledge. We don't compromise other principles in response to outside pressures, political, economic pressures to fake your data, or harm participants, or do anything else. You stay true to your method and your search for some truth, while trying not to be influenced by outside forces. Okay, so the thing about the three things, the three reasons that we have standards, right? The first one was protect the rights and welfare of participants. I'll talk about a couple of issues that come up under that general goal. One, related to the principle of beneficence, non-maleficence, is we're obligated to protect participants from harm or fix it if we cause harm, right? So obviously you can't cut people, shock people with a lot of shock anyway. You can't burn them. You can't cause damage to people, right? But pain researchers do have to find ways to cause pain to people, right? And sometimes it's putting your hand in a bucket of very very cold water, or putting some capsaicin or whatever stuff that's in chili powders on your skin causes a burning sensation. But they have to fully inform people about the amount of pain that they're likely to experience and all this stuff, and they have to be very careful about causing that harm and that it doesn't cause any kind of lasting damage. So be very careful about causing harm. And even more than physical harm, in our research, we worry about causing psychological harm. Right? So if you're going to ask questions about abuse history or other traumatic experiences, there is a danger of re-traumatizing someone. If they've been trying not to think about something and you make them talk about it and you don't have them talk about it in a therapeutic setting, it can do damage. Right? So you need to try to reduce the likelihood of causing damage. Right? But then if you do cause damage, if you do cause people emotional distress, you have to provide them with resources to help deal with that distress. And so anytime you're asking lots of questions about things, you usually put in a disclaimer: if you experience distress, here's the number, here's the counselor who will be on call and ready to help you. And sometimes even you may have somebody do a debriefing with all the participants just to make sure that they're okay afterward. Right? Another thing you may even think about that, participation itself may result in negative outcomes, may result in harm to participants. Right? If maybe you do primarily research on LGBT issues, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered individuals. So if anybody sees somebody participating in one of your studies, they see them coming to your lab, they may assume, right or wrong, that they're a member of the LGBT community, and if they're homophobic or what have you, they may try to harm them, yell at them, whatever. So you have to worry about if participation and people seeing that they're participating in your study will affect them in some way. But again, the key here, it's not that you have to anticipate every possible thing that could happen, right? So if they're on their way to your study and a piano falls on them, yeah, not really your fault. Right? The key is to prevent and or plan for foreseeable harm and what a reasonable person would expect might happen, and then address any harm that does occur. Okay? We also guard participants' privacy. Right? We don't make unreasonable invasions into their private lives. When doing a study, you don't throw in questions in your survey about their sex life just because you're curious what people would say. Right? You only ask stuff that you need to know for the investigation of your hypothesis. And then we protect the information that they share with us. We guard their privacy using either anonymity or confidentiality, depending on the circumstances. We're careful about coercion. I talked about this already a little bit. We don't make people participate, which again, the danger with coercion is usually in giving incentives that are too large. Right? Sometimes if they're really large, then underprivileged populations might not have as much freedom to say no, and so they'll feel more coerced to participate. And obviously, you don't. If you're a professor, you don't tell your students, if you want to participate in my study, that'd be great. If you don't want to, that's fine, but you'll probably get a C in the class. I'm just kidding, ha ha ha. Well, that's still probably coercion, because now you've planted the idea that if they don't participate, it could negatively affect their grade, and that's unethical. Okay. We also protect participants by fully informing them about the study, and they need to have enough information about the study to make a decision, a responsible decision about participating. And they also need to have the cognitive ability to make that decision autonomously. And we'll talk a little bit more with the next slide about everything that goes into informed consent, because it's a lot of stuff and it won't fit on this slide. But the last thing before we talk about that is just a kind of a reminder that in terms of protecting the rights and welfare of participants, we have to be especially vigilant when it comes to vulnerable participants. We have to take extra precautions to make sure that they're not manipulated or taken advantage of. Right? And we think about vulnerable participants. It might be children, cognitively impaired individuals, incarcerated individuals, anybody that is more likely to have a limited autonomy, limited ability to make decisions for themselves, and limited ability to say no for whatever reason. We have to be careful that they're not taken advantage of just because they could be, and they're easier to take advantage of. So extra precautions with vulnerable participants. Okay, in terms of informed consent, a lot of stuff do they need to know about. The purpose of the research. And this is, in general, you don't have to tell them exactly your hypothesis, but they have to have some idea of the purpose of research. And if you need to use deception and tell them something that's not the purpose of the research, then later when you debrief them, you've got to give them the actual purpose. At some point, they need to know this. Maybe not the front end, but at some point. They do need to know, and you can't lie to them about this, what they'll be doing and for how long. Unless the exception would be you could tell them it'll be, an hour, and it only takes 30 minutes. So you could lie about longer, but you can't make them do more than you would tell them. They have to know that they can withdraw at any time for any reasons. They're not locked in once they sign the informed consent. Anytime if they're not getting comfortable, they're bored, whatever, they can walk out with no harm done to them. They should be informed, obviously, of the benefits to themselves if they get any money or gift cards or whatever for it, or just satisfaction, personal knowledge, and also benefits to society. And then, most importantly, they need to know about the potential harm or risk of discomfort. So here are the bad things that might happen when participating in the study. Some people that are asked these questions recall distressful events, and it is emotionally painful, and so be warned. This bad stuff could happen. Right? We tell them how the privacy will be protected. So either your name won't appear on anything, or your name is only on this piece of paper with a code number, and that code is matched with all the other stuff with your answers on it, and only the researcher will have access to the key that matches the names to the numbers. But generally, you tell them how the privacy will be protected. They need to know how they can get a copy of the results if they want, not the raw data, but how the study turned out. They have a right to know that. Who the investigators are and how they can be reached, so your email and or phone number of the primary investigator. And then, like I said before, if deception was used, some debriefing where you tell them, okay, this study is really about this, we lied to you about this, this person was a Confederate in the room with you. Please don't tell your friends if they're about to participate in the study, pretty please. But, and sorry, we lied to you, here's the reason why. Okay. And usually people are okay with it if it wasn't a really bad lie. Okay. The second reason we have standards, we said, was to ensure the accuracy of scientific knowledge. So this means there are rules prohibiting the falsification, modification, or omission of data. Right? And falsifying data will obviously be that's clearly wrong. The modifying or omitting is where it gets a little squishy, where it's wrong, but it's more likely people do it. You're going through the surveys, you're in the computer, and you look at one and you're like, wow, they didn't answer it the way they were supposed to, and by the way they were supposed to, not consistent with my hypothesis. It looks like they skipped a few questions. I'm going to say, they probably didn't answer enough questions to consider this a valid survey. I'm going to throw it out. Right? So you start throwing out surveys that don't fit with what you're looking for, and you find semi-valid reasons for doing so. It's still unethical, and it's going to lead to a less clear picture of the truth. In terms of if you make an error unintentionally and then you figure it out later, you do have a responsibility to report that error. Right? So if it's published in a journal, you've got to call the editor up and say, "Ooh, my bad, sorry. I was looking at the data again, and the decimal point was in the wrong place. None of my findings were significant." And it's your responsibility to do that. If you make an honest mistake, you're not going to go to jail for it, but your reputation will be damaged if you don't figure it out before somebody else does. You're obliged to keep your data and your materials for 5 years. That way, if anybody wants to go back and verify that you didn't cheat, they can. And it's rare for people to ask for that, but you still have that proviso there just to kind of keep people honest. Say, well, you never know if somebody really could ask for my data. And if you publish something that you found an effect that nobody else has ever found, they might ask for your data. Okay. In terms of who you make your data materials available to in those 5 years, it's any other researcher, and it's any other qualified researcher, which generally means a professor or a professional researcher. Students, for the most part, aren't able to request stuff and get it sent to them, but if they have a professor email or a call, the person will usually send it on down the line. Prohibited from duplicate publication or presentation. This means that when you write a paper, you can't submit it to more than one journal. You submit it to one, and you wait for them to say yes or no, and then if they say no, then you can submit it to another. But you can't submit it to two. And you might say, well, I'm going to submit it to this one here, and then I'm also going to submit it to this one in Japan, because they won't read the one here. Prohibited from doing that. And the reason you're prohibited from duplicate publication is when people are doing their PsycInfo search, and you had some article about treating bipolar disorder. If it's published in two different journals, they'll think, oh, look, there's two articles about this treatment. It must really be good. There's a lot of research on it. There's not a lot of research on it. There's one article. There's not two. So it makes it look like there's twice as much research than there really is. Same thing for presentation. You can't present at more than one conference, with the exception of if you present at a student conference. Generally, that's kind of considered practice, and then you can go and present at a regional or national conference. The same thing. Otherwise, you only get one shot, one publication, one presentation out of your research. Related to that is a prohibition against piecemeal publication. And piecemeal publication is when you have one study and then you chop it up into a bunch of little papers unnecessarily. So you do a study looking at an independent variable and some treatment for depression, and you measure cognitive symptoms, physical symptoms, and affective symptoms of depression. And you find changes in all three variables. Instead of writing up a paper about the treatment's effect on those three variables, you write three papers. One about the treatment affecting cognitive symptoms, one about physical, one for affective. That would be piecemeal publication, and that's unethical. Okay? That doesn't mean that if you have a ginormous research project that you're not going to get multiple articles out of it, because you typically do. But you can't chop it up unnecessarily. Like when I did my dissertation, there was actually a group of us, 4 of us, collecting data on camp counselors working with chronically ill children. But we all had very different research questions that wouldn't have fit together in one paper. I was looking at which camp counselors were most effective. Another person was looking at which kids were more likely to comply with their treatment regimen. Another person was looking at something with parenting issues. So it could be the same project, but if there's different questions that can justify different publications, that's fine. But you can't unnecessarily and arbitrarily chop something up just to get more pubs. Academics may be under pressure to do things like that, and there are these rules to prevent that, because if there weren't rules, they probably would do it, because that's what keeps them from getting fired a lot of places. Okay. The third thing, the last thing in terms of why we have standards would be to protect intellectual property rights. So one aspect of this is determining authorship. If somebody deserves to get their name on the paper, on the chapter, right? And to get authorship, to merit authorship, APA says you need to you can get it either by writing some or all of the paper, or by substantial scientific contributions, which is sufficiently vague to mean a lot of things. Typically, it doesn't, like if you provide the database, you're managing a clinic and people want to do research, and you say, sure, you can look at the files. Typically, that wouldn't merit authorship. It might, but if you said, I'll let you look at the files if you can put my name on it, and you don't do anything else, it's probably unethical for you to do that, but you'd probably get away with it. Other things that typically don't merit authorship, if you run subjects, so if you didn't design the study, but you're a lab assistant or a grad student, and they say, okay, I want you to go to this lab, and people are going to come in, you hand them papers, and you tell them what to fill out and collect it when they're done. That won't get you authorship. If you enter data, that typically won't get you authorship. But I say typically because it depends on the people who are working on the project. And usually there's a primary investigator, somebody who's kind of in charge of the project. If not, there's a group this group is in charge, and they have a discussion about who's going to get authorship and who's not, and what would merit authorship and what wouldn't. And you tell people that before they do so. I'd like for you to enter data, and we'll pay you, $10 an hour, but you won't get your name on the paper. If you want your name on the paper, you have to do this, this, or this. Right? They can set out whatever conditions they want, as long as they're reasonable and you're told beforehand everything's kosher. Okay, so that's getting your name on a paper. And then in terms of the order of the names, so the order of authorship, who's first author matters. right? A first author publication, if you're a first author, that means that you did most of the work, right? It was mostly your ideas. That's your puppy. After first, second, third, fourth, fifth, it doesn't really matter. They're all not first. Okay. After that, it's just about pride, usually. But again, who gets to be first? And then after that, the order should be based on amount of contribution. And usually it's amount of intellectual contribution and not so much physical contribution. So even if you entered more data or ran more subjects, whoever did the most thinking and the most writing for the paper typically is the first author, at least in the mental health field. The medical field, sometimes it's backwards. They're kind of weird. But the things that you consider when trying to figure out the order of authorship, who's responsible for who wrote most of the paper, who formulated the hypotheses, that's a big one, who created the experimental design, who organized and conducted the statistical analyses, and that often is a different person, and then who interpreted the results. So again, a lot of the thinking stuff and the writing stuff is considered to be more important for determining authorship. Another thing in terms of protecting intellectual property rights, we always submit stuff for peer review before it gets published, right, to make sure that we're controlling the quality of the work, for one thing. So when if you're a peer reviewer and you're reviewing a paper that hasn't been published yet, so there's some new exciting finding, you can't go, "Ooh, that's really cool. It's not like the research I'm doing, and I bet we'll find the same thing, and we're only a week away from publishing." I'm going to say, no, that's a horrible paper, and you sandbag them, and then you go and you publish your own stuff. You can't do that. You can't steal people's ideas. You can't block other people's research just because they're doing the same stuff as you. They have an obligation to give an honest review and not steal your ideas. And then the last one is a big one, plagiarism. You don't take other people's ideas. You don't use other people's ideas without appropriately giving them credit, right? And this is a big deal, a really big deal. And so we're going to spend a bit more time talking about plagiarism in particular. Okay. So what is plagiarism? Plagiarism is the failure to appropriately credit the sources of words, images, and ideas. Well, I guess and sounds too, but that doesn't apply to us usually. But the Napster folks, I'm sure, would say, don't forget sounds. But for us, usually it's words, images, and ideas. Okay. Now, there's different types of plagiarism. The most obvious one is intentional stealing. Everybody knows what that is, right? When you knowingly take from another source, and you provide no citation indicating the source of the information. You act as if it was your idea, your finding, whatever. That's straightforward. Everybody knows what that is, and you know not to do it. What I've seen people struggle with and have some really negative consequences for here at our university is unintentional plagiarism, and that can happen for a couple of reasons. One, when there's inadequate citation. Okay. So you took from a source, maybe, and you cited, but something about the way you cited wasn't correct. Or you didn't take it from a source directly, but it's something that should have had a citation and you should have gotten a source for. Okay. So the first example of that would be the common knowledge and opinion. And this is where oftentimes people won't have a citation for something because, oh, well, I just know it, and I put it. If there's something that's a fact and it's common knowledge and you know it and everybody knows it, then no, you don't need a citation. Barack Obama was the first African American president of the United States of America. Common knowledge. You don't need to have a citation for that. Right? But if you say, So if you say something that sounds more like a statistic, like the majority of people who commit domestic violence are male, that's probably true, but you better find a source for that and cite it. Because sometimes when we think something is true, well, I'm pretty sure this is right, and you say it, you might be wrong. So you need to track down and make statements that are based, if you're going to make factual statements, make them based on observable, documented facts. Right? So you have to be able to distinguish between common knowledge and uncommon knowledge. And anything that sounds at all like a statistic, twice as much, half as much, 40%, you better have a citation. Okay. The other thing people trip on is when they express their opinions, but they express their opinions really making them sound like they're facts. Right. So if it's your opinion, that the majority of people who commit domestic violence are male, then you have to state that in such a way that it's clear it's your opinion or it's based on your experience. In my experience as a crisis intervention worker, the majority of clients that I saw were women who were battered by male aggressors. And you could say that, but to say that this is how it is, you can't do that without citing something. Okay? So if you're going to have your opinion, and you can put your opinion in there, make sure that it's clearly your opinion. Okay. Okay. So you have to know the difference between common knowledge and the stuff that's not common, and then if you state an opinion, make sure that it's clear that it is your opinion, and don't state it as a fact. Right. And one way to do that is to use tentative language. It's possible that da 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 da. Because, you don't have to cite anything to say it's possible. It's possible the Earth could burn up in 10 years. I don't need a citation for that. Anything's possible, right? And that's clearly an opinion. Okay. Another thing people stumble on is when they have a secondary source, right? Because sometimes you'll find a really interesting piece of information in an article, especially in the introduction section of an article. And if the article you're reading cited some other source, but you only cite the article you read, hey, I found it here, that's actually plagiarism, right? Because you didn't cite the source that they cited. So you have two options. Or you can cite it as a secondary source, right? So you found this really cool thing in the Smith and Jones article, but whenever they said it, they cited Garcia, right? I'm sorry. You found it in Garcia. When Garcia cited it, Garcia cited Smith and Jones. So you say Smith and Jones reported, because they're the ones that actually said the original thing, and then blah, 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 whatever they did, and at the end, parentheses, as cited in Garcia 2010. Right? And you can do that. You're discouraged from doing that too much, because what you should do is not be lazy and go find that original source. Go find the Smith and Jones article, read it for yourself, and if you do that, now you don't have to cite Garcia. Just because Garcia pointed you towards Smith and Jones, you don't have to give them credit for telling you about an article. Right? Now, if you use Garcia's interpretation of what Smith and Jones said, then yeah, now you got to go back and cite Garcia. But if you go back and read Smith and Jones and you have your own interpretation of what they said, then you just cite Smith and Jones. And that's what I would recommend: is find the original article, track it down. It'll be in Garcia's reference page, right? Look it up, read it yourself, and then cite that directly. But don't just say Garcia said blah blah blah, and really it's something that they cited somebody else for, because that's inadequate citation, and you would be guilty, in my classes anyway, of plagiarism. Okay. Another one that people really struggle with, and I can't understand why, is the failure to indicate quotations. Right. This is when somebody uses the exact words of an author and provides a citation. What? Dr. Fiala, you just said they provided a citation. That's not plagiarism. It might be. It might not be. If you provide a citation, it doesn't necessarily mean you haven't plagiarized. If you put a citation, you say, oh, Smith and Jones, 2009, but used their exact words, and you didn't put quotation marks around their exact words, and a page number in the parentheses, or a block, either quotation marks or a block quote, right? If you didn't somehow indicate that it is their exact words, that's plagiarism, even if you have their name on it, right? Because there's a difference between having their name on it and having quotation marks and not. One, it's paraphrased, and it's your own understanding of what they said. The other, it's their exact words, and you have to give them credit for their exact words by putting it in quotes. Okay. And you say, well, I changed a couple of words. That's good, but how many words can you get away with changing? I would change all of them, but my kind of rule of thumb that I have, my forward heuristic that I use and I find helpful is if you find yourself using 4 words in close proximity, maybe they're separated by an is or an and, but 4 kind of major words together that are exactly the 4 words of somebody else, and you changed all the other words in the sentence, go ahead and put quotation marks around those 4 words. 4 or more, go with a quote. Okay. And again, people try not to put too many quotes in their papers. In my class, because I tell you not to, and I'll take points away if you have too many quotes, because it's lazy writing. And 2, it is distracting to readers to have quote after quote after quote. Right? They want to see what's the essential information from this article, and not just what exactly did somebody else say. So you have to learn to paraphrase. And unfortunately, sometimes people, instead of paraphrasing, they'll do what I call thesaurus plagiarism. Right? That's where they just get a thesaurus out and they change each word in the sentence. None of the words are the same. Not plagiarism. And they'll cite it and they're like, I'm good, right? Well, maybe. That's kind of a gray area. I mean, technically, not plagiarism. It's certainly crappy writing. And in my opinion, I think it is still plagiarizing because you're plagiarizing the structure of the sentence. Right? So better off to leave it as is and put quotation marks around it, the original thing, or really do make the effort to paraphrase. And paraphrasing can be challenging, but it's important I think that's one of the reasons I challenge students to do it, is because it really challenges you to think about the material in your own words and convey your own understanding of it. Because nobody wants to read your book report of other people's articles. They want to read the synthesis of information and new ideas, new perspectives on existing findings. Right? And that's why we really push you to paraphrase and not use a bunch of quotes. So when you have to paraphrase, we'll talk about some guidelines, tips, really. One will be to take notes when you're reading articles and include citations in your notes. Some recent fairly high-profile cases of plagiarism in academia have been allegedly due to unconscious plagiarism, where people remembered phrases verbatim and used them in their own work, but didn't remember that they came from a particular source. They thought it was their own words. They'd forgotten that they'd read some book 5 years ago and had no idea that they'd be able to reproduce it word for word, but they did. Taking good notes will help keep you from doing that because you'll know where stuff comes from. Sometimes that happens. You'll think, I read something somewhere. They said this thing. I'm going to put them over. I can't remember where it is, and you'll be digging through your articles trying to find who said it. Write the important stuff down as you're reading, and put the citation on the notes that you're taking, and that'll help you organize your ideas. Personally, when I do this, I like to kind of go old school. I use note cards, and I do one idea per note card. So one article might have 2 or 3 note cards. It might have 30 note cards, depending on how many ideas that I think are going to be useful to me that were in that paper. Right. So on the note card goes the idea, and then also the citation. And actually, I use usually some sort of coding system for citations. I'll have a master list like Barnes 1999 is number 1, Garcia and Goldman 2003 is number 2. And so I'll just put 1, 2, 3 on the cards. That way you don't got to write down the citation every time. And then later, when you try to write the paper, you can use the note cards to organize your ideas. And I move them around and then staple them to a piece of paper, and then go sit on my computer and start typing. I've got all my ideas in order. And I know. Here's 5 different articles that all talked about the same idea. I can put all 5 of those note cards together, right? Because the idea isn't stuck to that paper anymore. It's on one individual note card. So that's a multi-purpose tip there. Take notes, include citations in your notes, and the elaborated tip is do it on note cards. Another thing is, it sounds kind of funny, don't read and write. And when I say this, I mean don't try to write while looking at it and reading the article. Because if you read a sentence that's beautifully written, and you set the article down, and you try to paraphrase it, and you look back at the article, no, I'm still chopping, and you look at it, you're going to have a hard time, right? The memory of the exact words, which is still fresh in your head, is going to interfere with your ability to retrieve a different set of words that expresses the same main idea. It's really hard to paraphrase when you're looking at that awesome sentence. So instead of doing that, step away, and the other thing is try to break it down, right? Break it down to the simplest possible connection. What's the gist? What's the main idea? Okay, here's this article. And so now when I'm taking my notes on my note card, they had this, 20-word sentence, blah, 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 blah. What are they saying in 4 words? And write those 4 words down. Okay. And then when you go to write your own paper, you'll turn those 4 words into 15 words, 20 words. Probably not going to be the same exact 20 words that somebody else wrote, because you've boiled it down and you're building back up from the bare bones, the main idea that they expressed. Okay. Okay. So there's a couple of tips about paraphrasing. Now let's look at an example. This is a sentence that comes from an article by David Gleaves titled "The Socio-Cognitive Model of Dissociative Identity Disorder: A Re-Examination of the Evidence." Interesting article. And this sentence, opening sentence of his article, within the dissociative disorders field, in much of mainstream psychiatry and psychology, dissociative identity disorder, DID, is conceptualized as being a post-traumatic condition resulting from overwhelming childhood experiences, usually severe child abuse. Okay, a couple things. One, the ellipsis, the 3 dots you see there, is because he also had in that sentence DID, formerly multiple personality disorder, citation for that. Non-essential information, so I just cut it out. That, if you're wondering why that's there, that's why. Another thing, notice that in this sentence, Gleaves himself didn't provide a citation for his interpretation of how dissociative identity disorder is viewed. Right? And because there's not a citation there, he's indicating to us that this is his interpretation. That somebody else didn't say that DID is a post-traumatic condition. That's his view of looking at the whole body of research. Right? And he is a major researcher in the field of dissociation, so it's not surprising that he feels comfortable enough making that kind of statement. If it was a student that wrote this sentence, I would probably expect to see them cite either some other expert saying this, citing Gleaves saying it, or the other thing, if it really is their perception, give me some information to help me understand why you have that perception. So instead of citing where you got the idea from, what are you basing that perception on? So instead of just parentheses with the author's names, you have parentheses e.g., so for example, and you give 2 or 3 example articles that provide the rationale or are the basis for which you made this evaluative statement about how the field views dissociative identity disorder. Okay, away from that aside. Now, looking back at the sentence. So DID, within the field and by these other people, it's conceptualized as a post-traumatic condition resulting from childhood abuse. Okay, so the main ideas here, trying to boil it down, DID caused by childhood trauma. Conceptually, it's kind of like PTSD. Okay, so a decent paraphrase of this sentence would be, and I'm going to cite Gleaves, even though I'm paraphrasing, I'm not quoting, but I still got to cite, got to give him credit to his idea. So Gleaves contends, so he argues, that DID is generally viewed, so instead of conceptualized, generally viewed, as a trauma-generated phenomenon that can be linked to abusive experiences in childhood. Okay, so now I've gone from being a post-traumatic condition to a trauma-generated phenomenon. Right? And Gleaves might argue with me about whether or not I've captured his essential idea or not. Right? But that's why I cite him. So if somebody reads them, they go, "I remember reading the article. I don't think that's what he said." They can go back and look it up and say, "Oh no, you got that wrong." That's one of the main reasons you have to cite, because if you misrepresent somebody's ideas, they want to be able to argue with you about it. But that's an okay paraphrase. Right? Here's a not okay paraphrase. Gleaves contends that DID can be conceptualized as a post-traumatic condition that results from overwhelmingly abusive childhood experiences. And it's clearly not exactly the same as the earlier sentence, but I've kind of tried to leave the stuff in italics that is pretty much ripped off. So conceptualized as a post-traumatic condition, whereas before it was conceptualized as being a post-traumatic condition. So took out the word being, so I changed there, and then that is new. But then instead of resulting from, I have results from, and then instead of overwhelming childhood experiences, which were usually involved abuse, overwhelmingly abusive childhood experiences. So that I would say isn't changing it enough. That's kind of like thesaurus plagiarism, which I probably wouldn't bring you up on charges of academic dishonesty for doing that, but I would tell you that's poor effort, and I'd give you kind of a low grade for crappy writing. Okay. One of the other problems we talked about was knowing the difference between common knowledge and opinions, and do I need to go find a citation or not? Because I didn't get it from anywhere. It's just something I know. Do I need to find a source for it? Let's look at some things you might see in a paper and think about when you read this if it needs a citation or not. Okay. First one, Freud's influence on the field of psychotherapy is widely acknowledged. Do I need a citation for that? I would say no, but I'd recommend finding one just to be safe, and it wouldn't be hard to find somebody who said that. Most people were okay with that and would say, yeah, that's general knowledge. His influence is widely acknowledged. Now, if you started to say his influence was formative or overwhelmingly positive or anything like that, now you better find a citation for that, because people disagree about that. Some people think that he was great for the field of psychotherapy. Some people say it was incredibly damaging, but nobody really says that he didn't have some influence. Okay. So no citation required, but again, I would recommend finding one anyway. Always better to find a source and cite it than to take the risk of saying something that should have been cited. Okay. Women are twice as likely as men to help one in distress, to help someone in distress. Does that need a citation? Yes, it does. And it may be true. It generally depends on what type of helping you're looking at, what type of situation. But yeah, as a rule, women do help more than men. But you have to have a citation for it, because just because you may think I think that's true, it's not always true. Right? And so you need to have some citation to just to kind of clarify under what situations you're basing this on. Okay. Some children might not develop appropriate social skills if their parents are not able to model appropriate social skills for them. Does that need a citation? Some children might not develop appropriate social skills if their parents are not able to model appropriate skills. I think. No, doesn't need a citation. If, and this is a big if this is your idea, if you wrote this and this was your idea, if you thought, I don't think if their parents don't show them how to act right, they're not going to know how to act right. If that's your idea, then you can write this sentence and you don't need a citation. If somebody else wrote this idea and you said, and they wrote it in a different way, but you changed the words, you got to give them credit for the idea. If it's your idea, you don't need it. Now, if I take the word might and I change it to won't, that some children won't develop appropriate social skill models if their parents are not able to model appropriate skills for them. Now I've stated it as a fact, I got to find a citation, right? Because that tentative language, that might, changes it from a fact to a possibility. And a possibility indicates this is an opinion. This is what I think might be. If you say what something is, it's a fact and you need a citation, unless it's a commonly accepted known fact. Okay. Last one. Most teachers who don't use behavior modification systems in the classroom struggle to maintain a productive learning environment. It makes good sense. Most teachers, didn't say all teachers, but it's still not tentative enough. Most indicates a majority, which sounds like the statistical thing. So more teachers than not who do something have this outcome. I need a citation for that. right? That sounds very facty, and it's not commonly agreed upon fact. Okay, so that one would require a citation. Okay. We'll go into more detail later about how to cite, but just here's a quick synopsis of what's needed when citing material. Generally, when you're paraphrasing, you need to cite the author or authors and the year that the source was published. Or accessed for some online stuff, but some year there, and then APA recommends page number or paragraph number for a non-paginated material, but it's not required. I don't require it, but it's not bad practice to do. It helps people finding stuff, especially if it's a long article. It's easier to find what they're looking for if they're trying to look up stuff that you cited. Whereas for quotations, it's some of the same stuff, author, year, but now page or paragraph number is required. Have to have that. Okay, so a little bit more detail required for quotations. Okay, and again, I'll talk more about the specifics of how to cite later on. But I just kind of want to give you a little bit of information now. Okay. Now, last thing we'll do is take a look at some stuff related to plagiarism. So here's the bottom of the screen. You see this little picture with a hunter shooting an eland, of course, and a little text down there. Right, it says Plate 2, blah blah, the association, and then I've recreated the text on the left, original source material, so that you can see it more clearly. So this is from a book. And it wasn't on a page, so it was in between pages. After page 150 was Plate 2. After Plate 2 was page 151. So it was kind of inserted into this book. The book was Intelligence of Dogs, Canine Conscious Capabilities by Stanley Coren, published by Mueller in 1994. Anywho, so we see the original text on the left, and as a brief disclaimer, so I'm not guilty of plagiarism. This material comes from a Virginia Tech tutorial website on plagiarism. So these aren't my words. So we have this text on the left and then more text on the right, and you have to figure out, is it plagiarism or not? Okay. So on the left, the association between humans and dogs began as a hunting relationship before organized agriculture had been developed. This Paleolithic cave painting dates back to about 10,000 years ago and shows a Stone Age hunter who has successfully killed an eland with the assistance of his dogs. A student wrote, "Dogs have been man's best friends since long before recorded history." Okay, that wasn't the first thing, that's fine. The association between humans and dogs began as a hunting relationship before organized agriculture had been developed. Starting to sound familiar. One Paleolithic cave painting dates back to about 10,000 years ago and shows a Stone Age hunter who has successfully killed an eland with the assistance of his dogs. Okay. So that one's pretty easy, right? Verbatim sections are lifted, no citation. So we've got the bolded sections here that are exactly the same. Even if there had been a citation here, it would still be plagiarism if they didn't put quotation marks around those words that are I have bolded here. Right. Okay. And just got the kind of side note for APA stuff. Note the student wrote, "Dogs have been man's best friend," and put quotation marks around that. The man's best friend, they're putting quotation marks to indicate it's kind of common saying or slang, and that's common knowledge that dogs have been man's best friend since recorded history. Don't need a citation for that. But the other note is, APA style, you probably wouldn't put quotation marks around man's best friend. You would use italics instead. But again, we'll get to that kind of stuff later on. Okay, let's look at another attempt. So now, same source material, different student version. So we still have the opening sentence, dogs, man's best friend, blah, blah. The relationship between dogs and humans started as a hunting cooperative before people developed organized agriculture. One cave painting that dates back about 10,000 years shows a Paleolithic hunter who has killed an eland with the help of his dogs. Okay. So what do you think? Plagiarism or no plagiarism? Well, we don't have verbatim plagiarism. There's no kind of four words together that are exactly the same, but the idea is still obviously been lifted. And no credit given, so that's plagiarism. And the other thing, this is a really good example of thesaurus plagiarism. So even if they had provided a citation, this would still be pretty crappy writing. Like, look at the last sentence. Just focus on the last sentence for a second. Killed an eland with the assistance of his dog. Killed an eland with the help of his dogs. Right? So change the word assistance to help. Left the structure of the sentence the same. Pretty much the whole thing, just changed a few words. Switched around, what is it? Before organized agriculture had been developed to before people developed organized agriculture. So rearranged a few words and then dropped in a few synonyms. Still not sufficient to merit good paraphrasing. And at least need to cite the source. Okay. Okay. Let's look at another one. So, dogs have been man's best friend, blah, blah, blah. Dogs and hunters first got together as hunters. That's the worst sentence. Cave paintings provide some evidence for this early teamwork. One 10,000-year-old painting shows a Paleolithic hunter and his two dogs after they've killed an eland. Okay, so now it's a fairly good job of paraphrasing. Not really well written, but that's the worst paraphrasing. But still no citation, so still plagiarism. Okay. One more side note for APA stuff. That phrase, dogs and humans first got together. Got together is a good example of colloquial language, which wouldn't be appropriate for APA style. Which obviously this book isn't psychological, not trying to conform to that style. Okay, the last one. Some experts think dogs have been companions for humans at least since our earliest records. Okay, so some experts think, it's kind of general. University of British Columbia professor of psychology Stanley Coren suggests that humans and dogs first got together as hunters. In his book, The Intelligence of Dogs, blah, 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 Coren includes a cave painting from about 10,000 years ago that pictures a hunter with two dogs and an eland they have killed, parentheses, plate 2. Right? And they have to put plate 2 because there's no page number. So now, pretty good job of paraphrasing here, and the citation isn't APA style because again this isn't a psychology article, but they didn't rip it off verbatim, and they provided enough information for you to know where the ideas came from, which is what APA style is trying to get you to do. So that wouldn't be plagiarism. It's not APA style, but it's at least not plagiarism, and that's a good thing. Okay. All right. Final thoughts. Ethical behavior requires vigilance. Right? It's not about trying to avoid getting in trouble. It's not that kind of vigilance. It's how do I make sure I do things the right way. And in most ethical lapses, at least I hope, occur because people fail to be vigilant. Not because people want to be bad. They don't want to be sleazy or cut corners. They just stop paying attention because they get distracted by other stuff and they get busy. So be vigilant that you're doing the right thing, especially when it comes to meeting your obligations to participants. Make sure that they're fully informed that you don't cause harm to them. You also may be vigilant about your obligations to society, that you're doing work that is productive. You're meeting your obligations to science, so you're conducting your work in such a way that it conforms to the generally agreed upon methods of science, and not doing pseudoscience or shady work that involves any kind of falsification of data or the stretching of claims beyond what's merited. Right? And then when it comes to plagiarism, which is a major focus, if you're unsure about if something should be cited on, I think this is kind of my opinion, I think it's common knowledge. If you're unsure, it's better to cite too much than too little. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.